Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christys. I'm not here to mess around. With all the biggest topics and guests, you will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
My name's Tom Harwood, and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today. I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked. Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
On Mark Dolan tonight, we have a simple plan, which is to inform, stimulate and entertain in equal measure. It's all about getting your opinions on the national television airwaves. I love my viewer emails, mark@gbnews.uk. So do join me from 9 p.m. to midnight every Friday, Saturday and Sunday for big guests, big opinions and a big presenter. 6'5", don't you know? See you then on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christys, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Join me, Arlene Foster, for The Briefing on GB News. Every Friday at 3 p.m, I'll give you all the latest political news and analysis, and we'll have robust live debate. To make sure that you're caught up on all of the biggest issues of the day, we'll bring on experts in their field. I'll ask the questions that you'd like to ask. We're not afraid to tackle discussions from all perspectives, including yours. Don't forget, The Briefing with me, Arlene Foster, every Friday at 3 p.m. on GB News.
Crisis in the Channel as migrant camps become overcrowded. Today we're asking the question, how on earth can this be solved? Also, the crisis in Northern Ireland. Will there be another election and how will it work? We'll also be exploring the Halloween budget that never was. Indeed, has this government abandoned pro-growth policies? All to come after the headlines.
Well, a very good morning to you. It's 9:30. I'm Rosie Wright, keeping you up to date today on GB News. As we've been hearing, more than 100 charities are urging the Home Secretary to create safer routes for refugees coming to the UK and to tackle the backlog in asylum claims. It has Suella Braverman's come under scrutiny for her handling of poor conditions at a migrant processing centre in Kent. It's understood hundreds were moved to the facility in Manston at the weekend, despite concerns of overcrowding. The Immigration Minister, Robert Jenrick, admitted the conditions were challenging when he visited. An immigration watchdog said they were left speechless by safety problems. Well, now, meanwhile, Kent police have confirmed the person suspected of throwing several firebombs at a migrant centre in Dover has been found dead. Police were called to the viaduct yesterday, where the homemade devices had caused a fire, leaving 2 with minor injuries. The suspect was found at a nearby petrol station and is believed to have taken his own life. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has congratulated Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva on winning the Brazilian presidential election. Lula narrowly defeated his opponent, Jair Bolsonaro, with a 50.9% of the vote. Bolsonaro has not yet conceded his defeat. Last year, he'd openly discussed refusing to accept the results of the vote, making baseless claims that Brazil's electronic voting system was vulnerable to fraud. Parts of Ukraine are without power and water supply after Russia targeted crucial energy facilities overnight. In the capital, Kyiv, a number of missiles damaged a hydroelectric power plant, leaving 350,000 homes in a blackout. Several other cities have also come under attack. 134 people have been killed in India after a suspension bridge collapsed. Eyewitnesses say several children are among the victims. The bridge over the Machu River was packed with hundreds of sightseers celebrating the Diwali festival. The bridge was only reopened to the public last week after a 6-month closure for renovations. We're on your TV, we're online and your DAB+ radio. It's GB News. Now let's head back to Tom for this morning's briefing.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:30 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now, Kent police are continuing their investigation into an attack on a Home Office migrant centre this morning. Petrol bombs were thrown at the facility before the suspect behind the attack was found dead nearby with a further device in his vehicle. Suspected migrants that were being held at the Home Office site have now been moved to Manston Migrant Processing Centre. The Immigration Minister, Robert Jenrick, visited the Manston site yesterday, calling the current situation intolerable. Well, this morning, Mark Spencer, the government minister, shared his thoughts with GB News.
We're working with local authorities. We've invested over £20 million with our local authorities up and down the country to accommodate people in different places around the UK. But the answer is a multiple choice question, if you like. So we need to get on with the Rwanda plan. We need to make sure we break the business model of those people coming across the channel exploiting people, and we need to process them at the other end and make sure we get to the right conclusions as quickly as possible.
Mark Spencer there. Well, we also asked the Shadow Minister for Immigration, Stephen Kinnock, for his thoughts.
We also need much better coordination between the Home Office and local authorities so that people whose asylum claims are processed and who are valid asylum seekers can be put into permanent accommodation in local areas and actually then start to be able to work, get leave to remain, contribute to society and integrate. We currently have 37,000 asylum seekers stuck in hotels in this country. It's costing the British taxpayer £6 million a day. That is the wasted money that Labour would redirect into resourcing so we clear the backlog and support local authorities so that we can get people out of these hotels, out of these centres like Manston, and actually get the system working properly.
Well, that was the view of the Shadow Migration Minister, Stephen Kinnock, and before him, also the view of the government. But let's get on the views of what's going on the ground. Enough of the politicians. Let's turn to our Home and Security Editor, Mark White, who is in Dover for us this morning. Mark, what on earth has led to the intolerable situation, as described by the government, that we're seeing in Manston?
I'm sorry, Tom, I can hardly hear a word you're saying.
Well, Mark, I will just keep the questions simple. Give us the latest.
Yeah, in terms of the latest situation, the investigation is still going on. We don't have a motive for the firebomb attack as yet. It's not, according to Kent Police, been declared a terrorist attack at this stage. They say they are keeping an open mind. It was 11:20 on Sunday morning when a white Seat vehicle rounded the corner here and headed down to that migrant processing centre. A man was seen inside the vehicle lobbing out 2, possibly 3 incendiary devices which were attached to lit fireworks, just improvised IEDs, improvised explosive devices, which caused a blaze at the perimeter fence. Obviously the images we've been showing on GB News, quite dramatic for a while, but brought under control fairly quickly by the security personnel here. We're told, according to Kent Police, that 2 people were slightly injured. Now, a Reuters photographer reports seeing this man then drive to a petrol station, which is about 200 to 300 metres just that way, and then take his own life. He said that he was clearly very distressed at what he witnessed, the Reuters photographer. So that investigation ongoing, but of course it comes amid a backdrop of a growing crisis within the asylum system here, and of course these small boats coming across the English Channel. I fully expect that this morning, when we get the official numbers out for those who crossed yesterday, that we will tip over the 40,000 mark, 40,000 people who have taken to small boats and crossed the English Channel so far this year. Now you compare that to last year, Tom, 28,500 came in the whole of last year. We're still a couple of months to run this year as well, arguably some of the busiest months, despite the poor weather conditions that you often get in the Channel at this time. Anytime there's a lull in the weather, they keep coming, and it's because of the sheer numbers that are coming over. As I say, 40,000, we're expecting that confirmation this morning of those who've come over so far this year. They need to be processed, and the processing centres here in Dover and at the Manston military base just further down the road towards Ramsgate just do not have the capacity to process these large numbers, and that's why we've got this backup, this backlog of people who should be processed within 24 hours and then farmed out to interim accommodation in hotels, and then after that council houses and other rented accommodation. They are in these processing centres in less than ideal conditions, and the numbers, as we said, just continue to grow, Tom.
This morning, Sir Roger Gale, the Member of Parliament for the area that contains Manston, was saying that he believed either this Home Secretary or a previous Home Secretary has made this problem worse by preventing people, by making it harder for people to go to hotels. Therefore, temporary accommodation becomes more permanent. Have you heard anything to back that up?
Well, the Home Office are denying that. They're saying that's just simply not true, and it doesn't give a true representation of the facts. And the facts are, there are so many people that the Home Office and associated authorities are having to deal with and process and then get into temporary accommodation that there just isn't room for them. They're trying to speak to hotel chains across the country to effectively requisition hotels. That's what they've been doing. We've got something in the order of 40,000 hotel rooms which are now being rented out on a daily basis at a cost of some £7 million a day. It is an enormous task. And then, of course, after they've been in a hotel, and sometimes they're in a hotel for many, many months, they then have to try to enter a sort of more semi-permanent state, if you like, in the likes of council house accommodation. Well, we know as well the local authorities are struggling with their own council housing stock, never mind having to then turn over increasing numbers of the dwindling supplies of council housing stock to asylum seekers as well. Another thing that's happening is the companies that are being co-opted by the Home Office are looking to the private rented sector and places like that. But all this is costing very significant amounts of money. And while the numbers coming across the Channel grow, the money that this government is having to spend on temporary accommodation and more permanent accommodation for these asylum seekers is growing exponentially as well.
Yes, a real growing problem. And I suppose even worse during all of this, while someone is claiming asylum in this country, they are prevented from working. The state prevents them from getting jobs, from making their own money, so they have to have taxpayers' money. Lots of different problems here, and of course they only grow as the numbers grow. But Mark White, thank you for bringing us the very latest there from Dover, and indeed from Manston down the road as well. Thank you. Well, turning to our next subject this morning, the ongoing political crisis in Northern Ireland after that deadline passed last week. The Northern Ireland Secretary, Chris Heaton-Harris, intends to call an election, though that date is not yet set. Heaton-Harris continues to hold talks with the Stormont parties, but Philip Brett of the Democratic Unionist Party said more discussions would be pointless. A reminder that devolved government in Northern Ireland has not functioned since February. Well, let's try and make some sense out of everything going on now. I'm joined now by Ian Paisley Jr., Member of Parliament for North Antrim and, of course, DUP MP. So, Ian, first of all, why has your party refused to join government? Is this your fault?
Well, good morning and thank you for having me on GB News. Can I just say that, you know, the reason why we have a problem in Northern Ireland, it's not to do with the devolved structures, it's not to do with the parties in Northern Ireland per se, it's actually to do with the fact that we have a protocol that is destroying business, destroying the opportunities for business across these islands, destroying internal trade within the United Kingdom. And that protocol was brought about by the product of violence. Leo Varadkar ran around Europe threatening Europeans that if they didn't put a protocol in place and a border between Northern Ireland and the UK in place, then the IRA would return to violence. Today, we have the outcome of that, that if you threaten these sorts of things and you put in place unworkable, uncontrollable, unacceptable structures like the protocol, then politics grinds to a halt. You see, Tom, you will understand this. Politics in Northern Ireland depends on one thing: consensus. Because we have a divided community that's had years, 40 years of troubles, to get peace and stability, you have to have agreement and consensus. Unionists do not agree with the protocol because it's destroying trade and undermining the union, and we're subject to foreign powers from Europe and they're unaccountable. Those things have got to be swept to the side. That rubble has got to be pushed away, and we've got to have a new understanding and a new arrangement that allows Northern Ireland to function properly and in an understandable and acceptable way. And so have an election. The parties will muster up to that election, will fight that election. Nothing will actually change. And until they sort out the protocol, there will be no change to this standoff. And really, it's a choice for the government. Do they want the protocol, or do they want power sharing? You can't have both. And so it's really about talking less and saying more. Let's have some action, Secretary of State, on the protocol.
And yet the government would say to you, Ian Paisley, that they are trying to act on the protocol. They've passed the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill through the Commons, although it is slowing down in the Lords, of course. They are concurrently having conversations with the European Union, trying to renegotiate it, proposed their own settlement of a green red lane situation that would allow the free flow of goods between GB and NI that were going to stay in Northern Ireland. And according to all reports, there is progress being made in those talks. Has the DUP stymied that chance by not giving the government time?
Well, I think it is fair to say that the government, I think, does have the will to change this. Of that, there is no doubt. I do believe that the government wants to change the protocol. They recognise that it's not acceptable. That's why they've brought forward the protocol bill. But it's stuck in that House behind us, and until it moves from the Lords, and I don't really care how many amendments they bring back to the House of Commons, as long as the House of Commons is consistent and re-endorses what they sent down to the Lords in the first instance, in other words, a non-amended bill, and implements that bill, we will be out of this mess sooner rather than later. So really, the one group of people who today are holding back power sharing are actually the unelected Lords in that building behind me. And the sooner they pull the finger out, as we would say in Northern Ireland, and get that bill back to the House of Commons unmolested and unamended, the better for resolving this problem. And I think that is one prospect. There hasn't been 1 hour of negotiations with the European Union on this matter. There's been, yes, talks, periphery discussions, and I think very positive discussions. But until the European Union extends the mandate, in other words, until they say we are prepared to negotiate and here's the issues we will negotiate on, all of the things that we're hearing about positive mood music from Europe is just that, positive mood music, but no change. And we've got to see changes. Talking, as I've said, let's talk less and say more. Let's actually have some productivity.
Now, through all of this, there's another player, of course, the United States of America. They often see themselves as the guarantors of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. I wonder to what extent, actually, this fresh set of elections, the failure of power sharing as it stands, might focus the minds of the Americans and, indeed, the Europeans into seeing that, actually, the protocol is a real problem here, that the Belfast Agreement does not work while there is the protocol in its current form.
Well, I think consistently US administrations have ignored the electorate in Northern Ireland. When there was a unionist majority in Northern Ireland, they were quite happy to ignore us for generations. But if there's the slight hope of a nationalist majority, suddenly they are prepared to recognise the democratic structures in Northern Ireland. So whilst America and some Americans might take that view, I think we have to recognise that the United States of America needs to play a role that is even-handed in Northern Ireland. And we've seen that from some administrations, we've seen it less from others. And being even-handed means that yes, let's uphold the laws and rules that are in place, but let's then make sure that we have consensus and we have consent from the unionist groups as well as the nationalist groups. And if we get consent and consensus, we will be able then to move on properly and constructively. And I think the United States of America, and we've got a wonderful US consul in Belfast, he's doing that. He's urging the parties to come to agreement on this protocol issue. He's urging the parties to find a way forward. But threatening us doesn't actually work. Look, Chris Heaton-Harris threatened us for weeks and months with an election. We're ready for an election. We'll take this to the people. Like Churchill, we say trust the people. So we're happy to go to the people. But it's Chris Heaton-Harris who's had the, if you excuse me saying for some of your older viewers, the Bobby Ewing moment. He's wakened up in the shower and it's all been a bad dream for him. He's decided now not to have an election. So we don't really know where Chris Heaton-Harris stands. Will there be an election? Will there not be an election? He's thrown confusion into this process. So I would appeal to the Secretary of State, focus on the protocol, fix the protocol, and we will get progress and we will get power sharing back.
It's a clear message from you, Ian Paisley Jr. Thank you so much for taking the time to spell it out. Sometimes this conversation can seem so very confusing for people at home, but I think that has set it out incredibly clearly. So I really appreciate your time this morning. Thank you. Finally, today not only marks Halloween, of course, I've got pumpkins on the desk actually, but the medium-term fiscal plan as well, that never was. Indeed, an economic statement from the government that is now expected on the 17th of November instead of today. Now, Liz Truss's vision for growth and tax cuts are thought to be dead in the water as the Prime Minister and indeed Chancellor set their sights on tackling interest rates and inflation instead of steering away from recession. But is the UK abandoning pro-growth policies? And if so, is this the right course? Well, I'm delighted to be joined by Stian Westlake, who is CEO of the Royal Statistical Society. And first of all, Stian, what exactly is going on here? We were expecting 8 separate packages of so-called supply-side reform from the Liz Truss government. They now appear to be abandoned by Rishi Sunak.
I think really we are all waiting to see what has happened to the underlying reforms in these packages. As far as we know, the big bang, the big announcement is not going to happen, which is disappointing. We hope that a lot of the measures might still be there, might still be coming out. And I think we're all really waiting with bated breath to make sure that this government takes economic growth seriously.
The mood music perhaps hasn't been that positive in recent weeks. Just yesterday, the Levelling Up Secretary Michael Gove was talking about reviewing and scaling back investment zones, the areas of low regulation and low tax that were supposed to level up in a conservative way. With that abandoned, with the pro-shale gas reform abandoned, with even onshore wind farms reform being abandoned, is there any hope for growth and development in the British economy now?
I mean, I think there really has to be, because we know that if you want to do anything else that matters to people, if you want to cut NHS waiting times, if you want to support Ukraine, if you want to fight crime, to do all of those things well and effectively, you need strong economic growth. We need to be able to afford to do these things. So I think this is a real opportunity for the government to say, how can we put some of these things on track? How can we make sure that we can invest in energy, make sure that there's the regulatory freedoms to do that, make it easier to build houses where people want to live, which is vitally important for economic growth, and make it important to make a climate where businesses are willing to invest. I think this is all crucially important.
I think it's so interesting to see where this country has ended up now, looking at where we were 100 years ago or so, when we used to sort of build so much, whether it was railways or houses or factories. We were in many ways the workshop of the world. And yet, while politicians helped facilitate that in the late Victorian era, politicians today seem to be doing everything they can to stop that same sort of development, to stop new railways, to stop new housing, to stop new growth and development. Is the mindset amongst our politicians just fundamentally backwards?
I think the problem comes when people forget that how important growth is to everything else that we want to do. And I think sometimes politicians lose track of the fact that there is a real risk of Britain slipping behind. It was not that long ago that Britain was a country that was as rich per head as Germany. Increasingly, we're drifting towards being as rich per head as Italy. If we're not careful, in a matter of, really, within our lifetimes, in a matter of a small number of decades, we could be as rich per head as Poland, which would be incredibly disappointing and would make it incredibly hard to build the kind of country I think we all want to see.
Yes, it's extraordinary. We started the programme today talking about the migration crisis to Britain. I suppose if growth is slow in future decades, we'll get a migration crisis from Britain as Eastern Europe becomes more wealthy. The trajectory is clear if we stay on this low growth path. But clearly, the Liz Truss government diagnosed this problem but could not provide a politically palatable solution. What, in your view, was the error that Liz Truss made? Was it focusing too much on tax rather than on regulation?
I think regulation is an important area to get right, because it's much cheaper to fix than tax. If you give tax breaks, you've got to either borrow more money or reduce spending in some other area. And the failure to do that, or the failure to tell a story about that, was clearly what spooked the financial markets in the last couple of weeks. I think there are a ton of regulatory opportunities, whether it's making it easier to build housing in parts of cities where people want to live, or some of the things that I know you and I have talked about before, how a regulatory system makes it difficult to build new power facilities, whether there's a renewable energy or whether there are things like gas or biomass. Fixing the regulatory system, it's not easy. It requires hard work by government. But if you do it, it can generate economic growth at relatively little cost to the taxpayer.
Really, really interesting there. Well, let's hope that the mood music is just the government trying to calm an excitable media. And hopefully, in that eventual statement we do see in 2.5 weeks, there may well be some supply-side reform tucked in there. We'll have to wait and see. But Stian Westlake, as always, thank you so much for joining us on the briefing this morning. Really appreciate your insights on probably the most important topic that faces our country right now. Well, that's it for the briefing today. Thank you so much for joining me and my pumpkins here on GB News. I'm with you for the next 2 hours as we dive in to greater detail to all of these topics that are really facing the country right now. So don't go anywhere. Join me on To The Point after this.
Well, the UK is shaping up like this today. Dry for many with sunny spells across the country, but sadly wet and windy in the west. Here are the details.
Well, starting off in the southwest, it's going to be calm around lunchtime with bursts of sunshine. Later, some rain is going to arrive and carry on late into the evening.
Well, in the southeast, it's going to be drier with some fine clouds setting in the afternoon. We also expect warmer temperatures again, at least with this time of year.
Now, in Wales, there's potentially going to be the odd shower here and there, but it should be mostly fine and dry. That warm spell will last throughout the morning and into the afternoon.
Moving on to the Midlands for you, plenty of fine weather actually, 1 or 2 sunny breaks as well. Again, unseasonably warm, though temperatures not quite as high as we saw over the weekend.
It's a similar picture for the northeast of England, with sunny spells for much of the day. It's going to get a little bit blustery at times, but thankfully will still be warm for those out and about.
Now, heavy rain will have pushed in across western parts of Scotland by mid-morning. It's going to be drier further east, albeit with some showers, before the persistent rain arrives a little bit later on.
Now, meanwhile, in Northern Ireland, expect a wet and windy day. The rain's going to be heavy at times, leading to the risk of localised flooding, as well as some difficult driving conditions.
So, for most, the rain will push eastwards across the UK, further showery rain feeding in from the south. And that's how your weather's looking today.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel. Hello.